Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. We look at the tactical, operational and strategic deception measures put in place in support of the Second Battle of El Alamein. We're going to be taking a worthwhile diversion from our El Alamein series to look at a great example of deception as a force multiplier, as well as the integration of deception at the strategic, operational and tactical levels. Traditionally, when we look at a battle, we look at the Orbat, the troops who fought in the battle, but we don't often look at the troops who didn't fight in the battle, nor why they weren't in the battle. When we look at the manoeuvre in a battle, then we look at where a unit is placed and where they move to, but we often don't look at why. The story of deception often gets left out, partially because of its nature. Secrecy is a fundamental part of the deception plan. And I think that security and secrecy that drives great deception plans often lives on after the battle, after the war, and therefore some of the lessons learnt from deception can be missing. Second El Alamein has got a myriad of deception plans, many of them orchestrated to create a unified effect in the mind of the enemy commander. We're going to look at some of those plans so that we can look at the lessons from them. We're also going to use it to really sort of delve into how surprise is generated, as well as the flip side of surprise, security and the importance there. And we're going to look at a not overly well-known incident that occurred in First El Alamein that had massive implications for security from the German point of view. Before we get into it, a quick list of references if you're interested in learning more about deception. I started with Battle Winners by Alan Smith. He talked about the deception plan for the massing of the artillery for Second El Alamein. We're looking at Second El Alamein, in particular the 9th Division Artillery Fire Plan, as a part of our decisive battles in support of the 150 years of Australian Permanent Artillery. His book tipped me off to the role that deception played within El Alamein. And as I was quite interested in this, as I did a little bit more research, I found out just how integral deception planning was to the battle at El Alamein. We've got Michael Howard's Strategic Deception in the Second World War, Nicholas Rankin, Churchill's Wizards, the British Genius for Deception, 1914 to 1945, Weaving the Tangled Web, Military Deception in Large-Scale Combat Operations, Practice to Deceive, Learning Curves of Military Deception Planners by Barton Whaley. That's a very interesting book. It's a little bit unstructured, but it has about 80 case studies that look at deception across a range of theatres, a range of wars, and discusses some of them in quite a fair amount of detail. And lastly, Tim Gallel, he is the head of the Army History Unit, and he wrote an article a while back about the capture of Unit 621, Lessons in Information Security from the North African Campaign. So very quickly, recapping the battles that lead up to Second El Alamein, the 26th of May 1942 sees the Battle of Gazala, a significant Allied loss. The British fall back to El Alamein, losing Tobruk in the process. They end up with their right flank on the Mediterranean and their left flank anchored against the Qattara Depression, widely held as being unpassable. The US at this stage has entered the war. Supplies and the equipment tap have been turned on, especially Shermans, which are better than the Panzer III, and so now time is on the side of the Allies. We see the first battle of El Alamein, including the battle at Tel el Eisa, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. This was fought from the 1st to 27th of July under Claude Auchinleck. Then we have the Battle of Alam el Halfa. Rommel attempts to break the defences before more supplies can reach the British. This occurs on the 30th of August to the 5th of September, and it's the first battle where 8th Army fights under Montgomery. This fails, and Rommel is now temporally wedged. Time is against him as the Allies build up reinforcements, and the Panzer Army Africa is at the end of a very long and contested logistics train. Rommel, without the supplies and forces to retain the offensive, transitions to the defensive, and he creates a defense in depth, which is quite formidable, up to 5 miles in depth. But it's not as flexible as it could have been. Rommel's mobility is limited because of the amount of fuel that he has on hand and the rate at which it's coming in. This means that he's going to have decreased flexibility in the committing of his armoured reserve. Traditionally, he would move his armoured units around, moving them from one crisis to the next. He's not going to have that flexibility in this battle. He's unaware of the Allied main effort, so he is forced to put the 21st Panzer Division in the south, 15th Panzer in the north, each with supporting Italian troops. In the past, Rommel had much better situational awareness, and this allowed him to do more with less, because he knew where the enemy was going to strike or where they were positioned when he was going to strike. It's a lot harder to operate when you don't have a copy of the enemy op board. This is the situation that Rommel finds himself in now. This is because of the loss of Unit 621, and we're going to look at that in quite a bit of depth. I think it's also worthwhile at this point recognizing the compounding effects that you get when you have an orchestrated strategy. So Rommel has been denied situational awareness. He is also being denied the logistics support that he would have normally enjoyed. This is a joint effect with naval attrition on German resupply convoys, and it creates the opportunity to amplify the effect of deception. Had he had more fuel, he could have waited and determined where the main effort was coming from and committed his reserve appropriately. He wasn't able to do this, and that allowed the Allies to make their breakthrough. So we see the Navy denying logistics support to Rommel's army, making his situation worse because of the fact that he doesn't know where the main effort is coming from. So let's have a quick look now at the doctrine. A little bit about deception, much more about surprise and security. I like to go to the capstone document when we're thinking about these big strategic concepts. I like to go back to the original LWD1, which is Sun Tzu's Art of War. And he states that all warfare is based on deception. Now, this is actually line number 18 of the book. So you can see that he placed a significant amount of importance on deception. And he states, all warfare is based on deception. Hence, when able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must seem inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. And when far away, we must make him believe we are near. Hold out baits to entice the enemy, feign disorder, and crush him. If your opponent is of choleric temper, seek to irritate him. Pretend to be weak. He may grow arrogant. I think that line is really important because it talks about the need to understand your enemy and to integrate your deception plan, not only with your plan, not only with the enemy's plan, but more importantly, with the mind of the enemy commander. Now, if we change armies and change a couple of millennia, we can look at what the current LWD1 says, and that is surprise. Surprise can produce results out of all proportion to the effort expended and is closely related to security. The ability of the land force to disperse and rapidly concentrate is critical to achieving surprise. Not all activities can remain concealed, so deception should be employed to conceal the intent of any action. That's the doctrinal definition, but it still leaves a couple of questions. What is surprise and how do we achieve it? Achieving surprise. Surprise confers a significant tactical advantage because the adversary is disadvantaged in attempting to effectively, appropriately, or temporally counter the friendly action. Surprise generates shock and increases the sense of rapid situational deterioration and corresponding psychological collapse within the enemy. And that little snippet harkens back to maneuver warfare, where we seek to create a turbulent and rapidly deteriorating situation with which the enemy cannot cope. The doctrine goes on to say, surprise limits our opponent's reaction time by affecting their ability to make decisions. Surprise also undermines our opponent's cohesion and morale. Surprising an opponent is a significant way of seizing the initiative and may be a critical precondition for success. Surprise is transient and must be exploited rapidly. Commanders should anticipate the effects of being surprised themselves and make appropriate contingency plans to safeguard their freedom of action. A couple of things there. We're looking at tightening up the enemy's OODA loop, their observe, orientate, decide, and act decision-making process, so that by the time they make a decision, by the time those orders are promulgated out to the troops in the field, the situation with which they pertained has changed and those orders are now no longer appropriate. We're also trying to consider what the enemy's most dangerous course of action is, so that when we wargame the plans, we can see what they would do, which would cause the most surprising scenario, and in that case, we can have preparations to minimise the risk from that. If we look at the UK principles, surprise is the consequence of confusion induced by deliberately or incidentally introducing the unexpected. Surprise is built on speed, secrecy, and deception. If successful, it achieves results disproportionate to the effort expended. This is from the NATO Principles of Allied, Joint and Multinational Operations. We still don't really get a sense of how we are to do that. Now, one of the old versions of the description for surprise was to strike the enemy at a time or place or in a manner for which he is unprepared. I actually like this version significantly better than the current ones because it tells you what to do in order to generate that surprise. The flip side of the principle of surprise is the principle of security. Security is concerned with measures taken by a command to protect itself from espionage, sabotage, subversion, observation, or surprise. It is a basic concern during any campaign or operation. Security is required to operate effectively with minimal interference from the enemy. Commanders at all levels are responsible for the security of their force. Security can often be best obtained by offensive operations which, by threatening the enemy's security, restrict his freedom of action. Security applies especially to information and requires that the enemy be deprived of the knowledge of one's own actions, dispositions, and intentions. So that's from the current LWD1. Before we have a look at deception and surprise from the Allied point of view, in particular at Second El Alamein, I want to have a look at the way that Erwin Rommel employed surprise and deception. Rommel, quite the manoeuvrist, was often fighting outnumbered, and he would use deception and surprise as a significant force multiplier. How did he do that? Let's have a look. The 11th of January 1941, Wavell's Western Desert Force has put the Italian army into flight. And on the 6th of February, Hitler authorises the formation of a two-division Deutsche Afrika Korps to support his Italian allies. Now, this is not the main effort strategically for Hitler. He's much more interested in the Eastern Front. Whaley, in Practice to Deceive, describes what happened. Rommel flew into the Libyan capital of Tripoli on February 12th, followed 2 days later by the new Afrika Korps advanced elements, namely part of a reconnaissance battalion and an anti-tank battalion, which within 50 hours was at the front 500 miles to the east. Acutely aware of his weakness, Rommel immediately decided that to enable us to appear as strong as possible and to induce the maximum caution in the British, I had the workshops 3 miles south of Tripoli produce large numbers of dummy tanks, which were mounted on Volkswagens and were deceptively like the original. This was done by setting wooden turrets on cardboard frames fitted over Volkswagen bodies. Other dummy tanks were stationary, merely wood and cardboard mock-ups. By the 21st, the first 35 had arrived at headquarters and additional 170 were under construction. At that point, the only real Axis tanks in North Africa were the 80 with the Italian Ariete division. So it wasn't until March the 11th that the first real German tanks got into the theatre, and these were 120, so 60 medium and 60 lights from the 5th Panzer Regiment of the 5th Light Division. The day that they arrived at 1100 hours, Rommel paraded them in front of Government House in a thronged town square. They drove past in seemingly endless numbers because he had them go around the block several times like some operatic stage army to fool any enemy spies. From there, they went straight to the front. Rommel's intelligence picture in Libya grossly overestimated the number of British forces that he faced. The British considered themselves to be on the defensive. On March 19th, Rommel was ordered to mount a short attack into the British lines after his full panzer division had arrived, and that wouldn't be until the end of May. His concern, though, was the likelihood of a British offensive, and he wanted to conduct a spoiling attack that would preempt their offensive. There is significant knowledge asymmetry in this situation. The British know the German order of battle, and they also know the orders from Berlin with the timing for the attack that Rommel is to make. On the 24th of March, Rommel starts to commence reconnaissance in force, and he discovers that the Allies to his front are quite weak. The way in which the Allied positions gave way encouraged Rommel, and he converted his reconnaissance in force into a general advance. This advance was routinely supported by tactical deception measures. These included dust clouds that were deliberately created to create the impression of large forces moving, as well as dummy tanks being positioned in various locations. Rommel's offensive action created security. Even though he had been ordered to attack in May when he would have at least a full panzer division at his disposal, he saw the opportunity, he seized, retained and exploited the initiative, and was able to push the British back 400 miles into the Egyptian frontier. The British were surprised, particularly by the timing of the attack, given that Rommel had been ordered to attack in May. In May 1941, Rommel had paused to enable his logistics to catch up. British artillery was becoming increasingly effective, so he relied on camouflage to decrease the effectiveness of that artillery. And he wrote, "To disperse the enemy artillery fire, we installed dummy tanks, mainly in the sector held by the Brescia, that's a weak Italian infantry division, and these did in fact soon draw heavy fire from the British artillery. Unfortunately, the troops had no idea of how to use such devices, which must be kept continually moving and not left standing for a fortnight in the same spot. I made repeated visits to the front to try and inculcate in the troops some up-to-date ideas on position warfare appropriate to the conditions they were facing." The 26th of May to the 15th of June 1942 sees the Battle of Gazala. This is a significant victory for Rommel. It leads to the Gazala gallop as the British retreat all the way to the El Alamein defensive position and creates the flap in Cairo with the concerns that Cairo is going to fall. Here we see an excellent example of know your enemy. Rommel had been fighting against Wavell for a significant amount of time now. Not only that, he had a copy of a pamphlet that Wavell had written called Generals and Generalship. This was based on a series of lectures that Wavell had given at Cambridge University in 1939. Rommel had a copy of the pamphlet, he kept it in his breast pocket, he heavily annotated it as he fought against Wavell. Rommel had also been able to see the effectiveness of deception in desert warfare. He wrote a paper entitled The Rules of Desert Warfare, and one paragraph stated, "Concealment of intentions is of the utmost importance in order to provide surprise for one's own operations and thus make it possible to exploit the time taken by the enemy command to react. Deception measures of all kinds should be encouraged, if only to make the enemy commander uncertain and cause him to hesitate and hold back." Here we see Rommel attempting to widen the OODA loop of his adversary, and he's using deception to do that. In preparations for the Battle of Gazala, he had tasked one of his tank repair companies with converting trucks to appear to be tanks. He also had a Luftwaffe workshop working on a specific machine that he had created himself. It consisted of an aeroplane engine mounted on the back of a truck. The propellers were facing to the rear, and this would create a significant sand cloud whenever the motor was turned on, creating the impression of a significant number of troops being moved. On the 15th of April, he wrote, "We're going to use decoy tactics to cause the enemy to switch the bulk of his forces up north to Gazala. The killer blow will then be dealt to them in the south." He later extrapolated, "Our job is to lure this British field army as far west as possible. We're going to achieve this by creating an impression that we are not going for an outflanking move to the south so much as a frontal breakthrough in the north. This will oblige the enemy to move up his armour. This is why each phase of our attack is staggered. The first feint by our forces will lure them up to the Gazala end of their line. That will begin at around 2 p.m. on X Day. Our main force will go in around here, pointing to the desert end of the British line at dawn the next day. You can really see the benefit, the return on investment that Rommel has gotten from his deception measures, given the fact that he was always fighting heavily outnumbered. Not only that, he was able to tailor the effects to the mind of the British commander Wavell because he had read some of the ways that he planned to fight. That gives him a significant advantage. Wavell, however, was no slouch himself when it came to deception measures, and we're going to look at why some of his deception planning wasn't as successful as it could have been. And we're going to also look at some of the changes in the tactical scenarios that are going to significantly impact Rommel as he moves forward. We've already discussed the deteriorating logistics situation that Rommel found himself in. Africa, being a secondary effort, was never going to get the bulk of the resources. Rommel was always going to be short. However, concerted Allied efforts make that situation significantly worse. But Rommel's situation is about to deteriorate rapidly. During the First Battle of El Alamein on the 8th of July 1942, Claude Auchinleck orders the new 30 Corps commander, Lieutenant General William Ramsden, to capture the low ridges at Tel el Eisa and Tel el Eisa. Ramsden tasks the 9th Australian Division with the 44th Royal Tank Regiment under command with the Tel el Eisa objective. Occupying Tel el Eisa were inexperienced soldiers from the Italian 60th Infantry Division, Sabratha. They had only just occupied the position the day before. They potentially hadn't dug in as well as they should have. At 0330 on the 10th of July, they were subjected to the heaviest bombardment that had yet occurred in North Africa. This was followed by an attack by the Australian 26th Division. Whilst it didn't gain all of the ridgeline initially, they took 1,500 prisoners. They routed the Italian division. At 0900 that morning, Rommel asked Second Lieutenant Vishman, an officer from his Signal Intelligence Company, Unit 621, for the latest intercept reports. Vishman had to tell him that there was still not established radio contact with the company yet. "Where is that company positioned?" Rommel asked. I showed him on the map. "Then it is Futsch. Lost," he said, absolutely furious. The Australian 2nd 24th Battalion had captured Unit 621, a German signals intercept company. Unit 621 provided Rommel with accurate and welcome information on which he could base his bold and varied tactics. His peculiar talent for gaining unexpected successes in armoured warfare, where radio communication played a vital role, had already bought him a number of startling victories as commander of a panzer division in the campaign in the West. In the desert, Rommel encouraged this new method of tactical reconnaissance, especially since the results of German air reconnaissance were limited by British air superiority. Unit 621 consisted of 10 officers, 63 non-commissioned officers and 259 other ranks, predominantly English language cryptanalysts, and they had experience from the Battle of France in intercepting and analysing British radio traffic. They referred to themselves as the Circus because many of their vehicles were civilian vehicles that had been commandeered in France. I'm going to rely on some of the excellent work in Tim Gallel's article, The Capture of Unit 621, Lessons for Information Security in the North Africa Campaign, as we delve into what exactly happened here. They'd been located near the ridge at Tel el Eisa, near the beach, behind the Sabratha division, since early July. The unit took up an area about 700 by 300 metres. They had 40 vehicles there and around 200 men. The location was chosen by Captain Seebohm, the commander of the company, partially because of its suitability in intercepting traffic from priority targets, which included Cairo, Middle East Headquarters, 8th Army Headquarters, 30th Corps, and the Allied armour that was to the front. He also needed to maintain communications with his direction-finding detachments and Rommel's mobile headquarters. This was because the intelligence that they gathered often was of a very tactical nature, and therefore its value was time-limited. Not infrequently, the intercepted enemy signals had been deciphered and were in Rommel's hands, while the enemy signallers were still querying them. Rommel thus often had signals in his hands before the enemy commanders to whom they'd been addressed. That is a not insignificant advantage when you're trying to compress your OODA loop, widen the enemy's, and now we can start to see one of the ingredients in the magic that led to some of Rommel's amazing victories. When you're reading the enemy commander's mail, the victory doesn't appear quite so amazing. Captain Seebohm had been questioned by numerous subordinates about the placing of Unit 621 so far forward. However, he stubbornly refused to reconsider the location of the unit. He knew the position was very forward, but he also knew that he would get much better results there, given the elevation that the ridgeline provided him and its location in respect to the call signs that it was trying to intercept traffic from. Seebohm had in the past been accused of cowardice before the enemy and threatened with court-martial for withdrawing from Mersa Matruh at the end of June. One of his subordinates wrote that Seebohm had been accused of cowardice before the enemy and threatened with court-martial for withdrawing from Mersa Matruh at the end of June. Wishman thought Seebohm was extremely ambitious and always wanted to win glory in Rommel's eyes by obtaining impressive results from our company, concluding that it was to achieve such brilliant results that Seebohm had taken the risks of putting our company in such an exposed position by the sea, just a few hundred yards behind a sector defended by Italian troops. In the event, when the enemy attacked, the Italians fled. Gazala also makes note of Panzer Army Africa's command culture. Rommel, with his throwing caution to the wind approach to risk assessments, strove to drive this approach down to many of his subordinate units. Unit 621, despite its value, had previously come into danger on two separate occasions. On the 24th of December in 1941, the Radio Direction Finder 3rd Section was overrun by enemy tanks and taken prisoner. Thanks to prudent action by the commanding officer of Direction Finding Section 3, this section escaped from captivity. The section salvaged its equipment, which was taken back to the company for repair. Then, just a month later, on the 24th of January 1942, Direction Finding 4th Section was surprised by the enemy on its way to a new assignment area. The commanding officer was captured with wireless documents, but freed himself by cool action and personally took 17 prisoners. And Gazala writes that it says a lot about the command environment that the alleged Mersa Matruh incident could have influenced Seebohm's decision-making process, despite the ramifications of these two previous incidences. This highlights the risk in chasing ground when placing ISR assets, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. Unit 621 was an incredibly valuable unit. Many of its operators had worked in London restaurants and hotels prior to the war. Their English was extremely good and they were used to working in a radio intercept role. It takes a long time to train those personnel. Seebohm's mistake, a mistake for which he paid the ultimate price because he was mortally wounded in the action, was to have significant ramifications at an operational and strategic level. Gazala describes this as one of the Second World War's greatest intelligence coups. This is partially brought about by the fact that the Sabratha division offered no effective resistance, and in fact it's been mentioned that Unit 621 was the first unit to offer any effective resistance, even though it was incredibly lightly armed. A 90-minute firefight ensued. 100 members were either killed or taken captive. Some of the vehicles were able to escape though. The issue for the Germans though was that because of the speed of the Australian attack, methodical destruction of the documents was not possible. The German signal intelligence history states that there was no opportunity to destroy the valuable intercept files. Thus, the enemy captured the German records of intercepted British messages and codes, the analysis prepared by the German Intercept Service, as well as German and Italian radio schedules and ciphers. And the lesson from this is that ISR assets are rarely capable of defending themselves and require protection by combat units. Emergency destruction plans for sensitive information and equipment must be effective and capable of rapid implementation. It wasn't in this case at Tel el Eisa. 17 members of Unit 621 were interrogated. 15 of them provided staunch resistance to questioning. However, 2 alerted their questioners to communication with two Abwehr agents in Cairo. Seebohm was actually conducting a visit to the unit during the attack, and it appears that he'd been travelling with a series of highly sensitive documents, which were captured when he was wounded. There are a couple of lessons that can be learnt from this. Resistance to interrogation training is effective in delaying the intelligence exploitation of prisoners. Adherence to the need to hold principle, under which documents of strategic value that were not needed at the front line should not have been held, in particular vital when moving to areas of greater security risk. Intelligence and security are two sides of the same coin. Poor communication security significantly improves an adversary's signals intelligence. And this is exactly what we saw in a lot of the British voice communications. They would use code speak, in that they would use code words for various places or identities. One thing that was noted, though, was that within the Indian division, where there was a significant number of officers who spoke Urdu frequently, that was completely indecipherable to Unit 621. The 2nd 24th Battalion wasn't really aware of the significance of the material that they'd captured. The 9th Division's intelligence summary states that 69 German POWs were identified as belonging to 3 Company 56 Signal Battalion. Some very valuable documents, including wireless intercept messages, were captured from this company. The 26th Brigade's War Diary states that appreciation has been expressed concerning captured material and documents sent back. Much valuable information has been gained. Over the following days, war diary entries implore soldiers to hand in any souvenirs and documents of potential intelligence value. Gazala asked the question as to why the importance had been underplayed in the war diaries, and there's a couple of reasons. Firstly, the 2nd 24th's CO had been captured shortly after the battle at Tel el Eisa when his vehicle took a wrong turn during the battle. Also, gains of such an important nature, potentially a strategic nature, need to be kept quite secure. A good example of this was 8 months earlier, a German headquarters radio car had been captured, and it came complete with an Enigma machine and several days' worth of messages in plain text. This should have been an important breakthrough for British crypto analysts. However, the Germans were aware that the Enigma machine had been lost, and it created a minor disaster because after the 23rd of November, all Africa Corps cipher settings had been changed, and that traffic couldn't be read again until April 1942. The impact of this was profound, and Gazala writes that Unit 621's capture caused irreparable damage to Rommel's campaign. The unit had been the source of much of Rommel's order of battle and operational intelligence. The consequent reduction in its effectiveness was a severe blow to Rommel, who depended during the remainder of July on inadequate information from local sources. As one authority concluded, many of the bold Africa Corps manoeuvres, which were recorded in the war histories as lucky or strokes of genius, were only made possible by the information furnished by the listening companies. So we'll leave this episode here, and we'll come back next week and look at the operational and strategic implications for the capture of Unit 621, and then we will continue on with our look at deception during the Second Battle of El Alamein.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.